So, I want to talk about something truly fascinating today. It's a case of what you might call convergent social evolution. What happens when two totally different cultures, thousands of miles apart, end up inventing the exact same system for something as deeply human as finding love?
I mean, that's the big question, right? Can you really turn finding love into a science? Well, back in the early 2000s, two completely separate subcultures, one in the West and one in China, they didn't just ask that question. They answered it with a resounding yes. And they got to work building this incredibly complex, engineered solution to romance.
So how on earth did this happen? Well, it all kicked off with the same problem that a lot of us face. Trying to find a partner in this huge anonymous city where all the old rules, the old script, had just been thrown out the window.
And it is wild to see how these different pressures led to the exact same place. You know, in the West, it was kind of a slow burn. The traditional ways of meeting people, through family, through your local community, they just weren't really a thing anymore, which left people feeling lost. But in urban China, wow, the pressure was way more intense. You had the one-child policy creating a huge demographic imbalance, and at the same time, rapid urbanization just blew up the old family matchmaking networks. This created this intense, measurable risk of never getting married.
Okay, so here's how we're going to unpack all this. First, we're going to dig into the core logic, how they turned intimacy into a technical problem. Then, you're not going to believe this, we'll look at the identical playbook they created. We'll also check out who was drawn to these systems, see how they evolved in totally different ways, and wrap up with a pretty big question about what this all means for connection today.
All right, let's get into the core logic, because this is really the fundamental mindset shift that powers this whole story. Both of these groups, on opposite sides of the world, basically decided that romance wasn't magic. It was an engineering problem, and it could be solved.
So the Western system, they approached it like a game, right? Like a series of puzzles that had actual solutions you could figure out. The Chinese system, on the other hand, was all about turning the scary, uncertain process of finding a spouse into a manageable project with clear steps. But look at the key words: deconstruction, replicability, roadmaps. Both decided dating was just another skill, something you could learn, you could practice, and you could master.
And this is the most crucial part. This whole thing wasn't really about being cynical or cold-hearted. It was about agency. It was about giving people a map in a world where they felt completely lost. These systems took that awful, paralyzing anxiety of, I have no idea what to do, and turned it into the much more manageable challenge of just learning and executing a specific technique. It was a promise of control. Okay, now this is where the story gets really, really weird. Because in trying to solve this problem, these two totally isolated cultures developed a nearly identical tactical playbook, right down to the words they used.
I mean, just look at this. It's absolutely remarkable. The Western idea of controlling the frame of a conversation is identical to the Chinese concept of guangjia. A technique for a backhanded compliment called a neg is the same as da ya. Even DHV, which is short for demonstrating higher value, has a direct translation. And get this, both of them called that critical opening moment the hook point. It's just an unbelievable example of convergent evolution in social tactics.
So let's take the neg, for instance. A lot of people misunderstand this as just being an insult, but inside these systems, it was this very specific, calibrated tool. It was a mild, kind of backhanded compliment you'd use to level the playing field with someone who seems, way out of your league. It's designed to show you're not intimidated.
And the hook point, well, that was seen as the first major victory. It wasn't about getting a number or anything like that. It was about identifying that exact moment when a stranger goes from just being polite to being actively, genuinely engaged in the conversation. Both systems saw this as the absolute critical first hurdle to clear.
They even created these similar and, let's be honest, often very controversial frameworks for what happens later on. Both systems identified a phenomenon they called last-minute resistance, or LMR, and they saw it not as a hard stop, but as a predictable psychological checkpoint that you had to understand and learn how to navigate.
So who were the people who were actually drawn to these super structured, almost clinical systems for finding love? Well, the answer reveals yet another fascinating parallel.
So yeah, the labels are a little different, but the reasons people joined are strikingly similar. You've got folks who are all about efficiency, people who felt like they basically needed a remedial class in social skills, and then the strategic thinkers who were trying to find the absolute best partner they could. And the demographic was often the same too. Lots of professionals in technical fields, engineers, programmers, finance guys, people who are just comfortable with systems and data.
And this is so important to get. For so many of these people, the common thread wasn't that they rejected romance. No, it was that they wanted it so badly, but they felt like the old, messy ways just weren't working for them. They saw this as a more logical, more disciplined path to finding a real, lasting connection.
But for all those similarities we've talked about, this is where the two paths really start to diverge. The long-term goals of these systems show a massive cultural difference in how they evolved over time.
The Western system, it began almost entirely focused on the short game, casual, short-term encounters. But pretty quickly, guys hit a wall. They realized the skills that worked for a one-night stand were actually pretty toxic for a real relationship. So that forced this evolution, this hybrid turn, where they started trying to figure out how to use these tactics to find a real long-term partner. Now, contrast that with the Chinese system, which was built from day one with a single, crystal-clear goal in mind: marriage. It was a direct answer to that marriage squeeze we talked about. And yeah, they borrowed some ideas from the West, but the main goal, the unshakable objective, was always finding a spouse and starting a family.
And this slide just sums it up perfectly. The Western system had to evolve towards a long-term goal because, well, it had to. The Chinese system was built for that long-term goal right from the very start.
So, after all of this engineering, all of this optimization, what's the big takeaway? What should we make of this whole global experiment in systematized romance?
Well, it seems to be that even the most detailed, complex system couldn't actually solve the fundamental tensions of being a human trying to connect with another human. You know, things like performance versus authenticity, like how can you be your real self when you're following a script? Or strategic optimization versus romantic surrender. Can you really fall in love if you're always trying to control the outcome? These systems didn't solve these dilemmas, they just put a giant spotlight on them.
In the end, their lasting impact, their legacy, is probably this idea that social and relational skills aren't just something you're born with or not. They can be broken down, they can be studied, and they can be practiced. You could see this whole thing as a massive, crowdsourced attempt to draw a logical map for the most illogical and complex territory there is, the human heart.
And that leaves us with one last, pretty provocative question. In a world that's becoming more and more about data and optimization, was this all just a strange little subculture, or is this idea of a measured heart actually a preview of the future of connection for all of us?